This is what we're looking at today. We're finishing off a series I started in January called Atomic. It had to do with small changes we can make that make a big difference. And we've been marching through the Gospel of John. And it's been a pretty interesting journey together as we've been looking at some academics and some different ways of understanding our faith, God, ourselves, and how to enter into the world with all these things working together. Today we're talking about Odyssey, which is the journey that we're on. And we're going to look at it sort of an unusual Easter story. In our meditation, I verbally shared the story of Easter Day with you, and I want to fast forward with you to sometime later. Maybe it's a month later, we're not quite sure exactly, but it's sometime beyond that Easter Sunday. The disciples have another encounter with Jesus. Now let's take a look and see what happens. So we'll just march through this text together. After this, Jesus appeared again to the disciples, this time at the Tiberias Sea, the Sea of Galilee. And this is how he did it. Simon Peter, Thomas, nicknamed Twin, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the brother Zebedee, and two other disciples were together. Simon Peter announced, "I'm going fishing." And that's not just because he's a guy that likes to go fishing. He's a fisherman. And so he's saying to the guys, it's time to go get our catch. We got to make a living. And so here we go. We're going to go do this. And the rest of them replied, "Well, we're going to go with you." So they went out and got in the boat. They caught nothing that night. When the sun came up, Jesus was standing on the beach, but they didn't recognize him. Remember that. He was standing on the beach, and they didn't recognize him. Later on, we're going to find out they're like 100 yards offshore. So that's not that far. And yet they could not recognize him. It's very curious. Then Jesus spoke to them, "Good morning. Did you catch anything for breakfast?" And they answered, "No." He said, "Throw the net off the right side of the boat and see what happens." They did what he said. All of a sudden, there were so many fish in it, they weren't strong enough to pull it in. Then the disciple Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the master." When Simon Peter realized that it was the master, he threw on some clothes, for he was stripped for work. This is kind of an interesting thing. Peter tried to get this idea of naked fishing off the ground back in the first century. Never really caught on, but anyway, tip of the hat to Pete for giving it a whirl. So he threw on some clothes, for he was stripped for work, and dove into the sea. The other disciples came in the boat, for they weren't far from land, 100 yards or so, pulling along the net full of fish. When they got out of the boat, they saw a fire laid with fish and bread cooking on it. So Jesus already had breakfast ready with a campfire. And Jesus said, "Bring some of the fish you've just caught." So Simon Peter joined them and pulled the net to shore, 153 big fish. And even with all those fish, the net didn't rip. Now, the reason we have this detail, according to some of the scholars in John's Gospel, this idea of 153, which is an enormous catch, and the net didn't rip, was a nod to the early church, saying, this thing is bigger than we expected, and as it continues to expand, it's going to hold together. The net is going to hold. And that's true. It has. We're here today, 2,000 years later, and they could never have imagined how the good news of what Easter is about and all that it represented about the person of Jesus before that and after that, and it's still held together. And it's the largest religious expression in the world. It's amazing. So it's still holding together. Jesus said, "Breakfast is ready." Now, catch this. This is so interesting. Not one of the disciples dared ask, "Who are you?" They knew it was the master. Do you realize what that's saying? It says they didn't recognize him. He looked different than they ever would have imagined. This resurrected Christ. They walked with this guy 3 years. And yet when they're there, they couldn't recognize him 100 yards out. They couldn't recognize him when they're face to face. And yet they knew it was him. A new expression, a new way of looking. That's going to be really important later on. Okay, well, the story continues. This thing's all a big setup, because then Jesus took the bread and gave it to them. He did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus had shown himself alive to the disciples since being raised from the dead. And after breakfast, Jesus said to Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, Do you love me more than these?" "Yes, Master, you know I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my lambs," which is exactly what you would say to a fisherman, right? So then he asked a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" "Yes, Master, you know I love you." And Jesus said, "Shepherd my sheep." And then he said it a third time, "Simon, son of John, seriously, do you love me?" And Peter was upset that he had asked for the third time, "Do you love me?" So he answered, you can just imagine his voice hushing a little bit, "Master, oh, you know everything there is to know. You've got to know that I love you." And Jesus said, "Feed my sheep. I'm telling you the very truth now. When you were young, you dressed yourself and went wherever you wished. But when you get old, you'll have to stretch out your hands while someone else dresses you and takes you where you do not want to go." He said this to hint at the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. He would be crucified. That's how he was going to die. And then he commanded, "Peter, follow me." Now, turning his head, this is such a classic Peter move and such a classic human move. Turning his head, Peter noticed the disciple Jesus loved following right behind. And when Peter noticed him, he asked, "Well, Master, what's going to happen to him?" As if to say, if it's going to be terrible for me, can it at least be terrible for that guy too? And Jesus said, "If I want him to live until I come again, what's that to you? You, Peter, you who say you love me, follow me." So on the next slide, in May of 2003, May 14 to be precise, of 2014, my family, my wife and I and our 2 kids, started a new Odyssey. Literally, we bought this car. It's a Honda Odyssey, 2003, brand new. And we traded up. It's kind of a fun little story about that. The only family car that my kids had known before this was an original model of the Honda Odyssey, the first generation of them, which had like 4 normal car doors, and it was pretty cool. It was like a step into that painful world of buying a minivan, you know what I'm saying? And so for a range of reasons, we decided it was time to make the shift and trade in and trade up. And so we're at the dealership, and the kids are seeing all this thing happen. Noah, my older kid, he's 6 years old at that time. My daughter is 4 years old at that time. My son is just pushing every button possible, opening the doors. This was when those automatic door things were kind of new, you know, and they magically open at the press of a button and they open up by themselves. Had a DVD system in it. They were super excited about that, or at least Noah was. My daughter Lakin, on the other hand, takes a look inside the van, spends no more than 15 seconds looking at this definite upgrade, leaves it, gets back into our original car, puts herself in her car seats, buckles herself up, and starts to sob. I know, it's pathetic, isn't it? Well, no, it's beautiful, it's cute and adorable. Lakin did not want to leave her old car. She'd grown it was the only minivan she'd ever loved. Would she be able to love another minivan was the big question. And she was pretty convinced that day that she would not, in fact, be able to love again the way she loved our original family car. Well, she didn't win that day, and we ended up getting this van. It looks exactly like that when it was brand new. And we took this thing all over the place. We had so many Odysseys in our Odyssey. I mean, we went all over California. We're transplants from the Midwest, not like some of you California natives who still haven't been, you know, as far out of town as Vallejo or Santa Rosa. We've seen it all, man, and we've loved it all. And most of it we saw because of that thing. And if we weren't here, then we were cutting across the country to go see whatever national parks in Utah or Nevada or Colorado, or road tripping for a wedding all the way across the country. This Odyssey helped us on our Odyssey for 16 years. And it kind of looks as if that happened, because the next shot is what it looks like today. There it is, in all of its beauty. I even put this on your bulletin so all of you could remember what our family car looks like today after 16 years of pulling us into our family Odyssey together. If you open up this thing, and by the way, if any of you want to have a tour later today, I parked it right here in front so all of you can see it together. If you'd like to take a selfie with it after church, I don't know a better Easter backdrop than this beautiful piece of equipment. But if you open up the car door on this thing, you'll know pretty quick that it is no longer brand new. The seats are looking a little bit worn. If you look at the floor mats, particularly on the driver's side, it's wearing through all the way through, and I'm not going to replace it, come on. If you look back where the kids' seats are, you see evidence of grape juice boxes once enjoyed, right? There may even still be some crumbs around from something, who knows? Oh, that reminds me, I provided breakfast for you guys. So on your table there should be 2 packs of these, and if you would, just open these up and start enjoying these right now, because I could get long-winded. We could go till 3 o'clock today, who knows? And I want you to be well fed. So please share these. This is not communion, just eat them and enjoy them. It'll make sense in just a minute. They're pretty good. Anybody ever had these Belvita things before? Oh, not bad. Yeah, go ahead. Consider it blessed. So anyway, I noticed this morning, I already knew that some things in this 16-year-old car don't work. Like one of the rear windows, the button just doesn't open anymore. And I'm not going to spend the $300-400 that the dealership wants to repair the thing with. I noticed on my way in this morning, I hit cruise, and nothing happened. I mean, no lights, no nothing. I was like, oh man, one more piece of evidence that this is an old car. It doesn't have Bluetooth. So I had to do this extra gizmo and wire that thing up so we can do, the call thing and all that and play stuff on our phone. However, I do have to brag on this a little bit. You already know it's got the DVD entertainment system. That's pretty sweet. It also has a CD player. It has AM and FM radio. And, wait for it, a cassette player. I mean, come on. It's pretty sweet. We're applauding for that. Yes, why not? So if you want to make me an offer on this puppy today, I'm open to it. And if you look carefully on the outside, you may notice it's had some history. If you look really close in the sun, you can't really tell from the picture, but it was involved in some accident many years ago, and the shop was looking at it, and they were like, when they brought this thing over from Japan and they painted the trim work, they picked the wrong color. And I was like, what are you talking about? And he pulls me out there and says, look, all the handles and the bumpers, they're not the same color as the body, because that's how they do things around here. And so it's now a 2-tone colored vehicle, which adds to value, I think. But you can't miss the latest thing that happened just 1 year ago when Noah was coming home, using the van to take all of his stuff from college and move it back up here. His friend who was following him was going to stay the night with us. They were paying plenty of attention, but they had a very quick stop. And the guy behind Noah couldn't stop quick enough, ran into Noah, which ran him into another car. So on the front, you've got this beautiful crack right in the front bumper. It doesn't quite line up right. And if you look on the back of the car, it's got this wonderful wrinkle on the back bumper. It's really a sight to behold. There's no way that you would look at this car now and say, that's a new Odyssey. There's no way you would do it. But Peter, the disciple, kind of had visions of grandeur about himself. And he kind of walked around like he was a new Odyssey. He was one of these guys, I actually relate a lot to him, that was probably worried a little too much about what people thought of him and his image. And so he tried to put on a good facade as much as he could. So when Peter first was called aside by Jesus for this first come to Jesus meeting, if you will, and Jesus asked Peter, how you doing, Pete? Pete would say, I'm great, I'm doing good. But in fact, things were not good. Because just a short time before, they'd had this thing called the Last Supper. And at the Last Supper, it was kind of a climax event for the disciples. I mean, they thought this was going to be a champions dinner. Like, very soon, Jesus is really going to come into his own and really take the world stage. And they were going to be right there with him. And they were going to see God do incredible things. And everything's going to change. It's going to be awesome. And they're going to be on top with Jesus. And Peter, in a moment of heartfelt sincerity, says to Jesus, "You know, Jesus, I just want to let you know, I love you, man. And I will go anywhere you go. I will even go to the death for you. That's how much I love you." And you could kind of hear it in his tone that the other disciples are rolling their eyes like, "Thanks, Pete. Thanks for making us all look like we don't love Jesus that much." But you know what Jesus did after that? You've seen the movie. As Jesus looks at Peter and says, "Pete, man, I really appreciate that. But I got to be honest with you. I know a thing or two about who you are and how you're made. And the reality is, the heat's going to get turned up tonight. And before dawn breaks tomorrow, you're going to deny even knowing me 3 times. Now, Pete didn't believe it. But it's what happened. After Jesus got arrested and his awful journey was starting, Peter was hanging around, trying to stay close. And 3 times in a row, people recognized him as a northerner. Just like we know people, you can pick people out from the deep south as soon as they open their mouth. So he could get picked out as well. His look, his clothing, his accent. And so he was asked 3 times in succession, "Aren't you one of his guys?" And he denied it 3 times. So this meeting that we see at the end of the Gospel of John is more than just an appearance for the disciples' sake, to see that Jesus is still alive in some fashion. He's coming to restore Peter. He's coming to help heal this wound for Peter's sake, for the disciples' sake, for the sake of the future of the movement. And I want you to recognize something that's taking place here. How Jesus sets the stage. This is just so practical for us to pay attention to. And sometimes we're going to get this right. But so Jesus enters into this whole scene, this whole morning, knowing what he wants to do. He wants to see the disciples, have a good experience with them, provide an interesting time for them. But he knows he's going to have a difficult conversation with Peter. So what does he do? He sets the stage in every possible way to make that as fruitful and positive as possible. So he starts the day with the biggest catch of fish that these poor fishermen have ever seen. And they're thrilled about it. This was a very bad day of fishing, just became a great day of fishing. Not only are their bellies going to be full, but so are their wallets. They're not going to have to worry about money for a while. So they come to shore and they're feeling pretty good, and Jesus cooks breakfast for them. I don't know too many people who don't like a nice little campfire and have breakfast made for you, and it's all right there, and they're having good community and having some laughs, and it's another experience of the resurrected God, Christ. I mean, come on, that's amazing. And then he steers it in a different direction. But did you notice what Jesus did there in terms of creating an environment where this kind of conversation can happen? You notice what he didn't do? As soon as Peter got to shore, wearing his clothes now, I guess, Jesus doesn't say to him, "Get back in the water, you denier." And when they all come around the campfire for breakfast, Jesus doesn't say, "Peter, I'm sorry, man, you blew it. So no communion for you. No food for you." And he doesn't tell the disciples, who have big edge toward Peter because of that and are wondering who's in charge now, he doesn't say to them, "Hey, you who are having a real issue with Peter, no food for you." Now, everybody's welcome around this campfire. Everybody's welcome in this communion, because that's the stage of grace. Now, I want to take that to another level for you. A lot of times when I talk to people about death and dying and what's next, our cultural way of thinking about that is so often tied to the image of a judge. A judge is going to come down, swing the gavel to determine our fate. and we tell ourselves we believe the right things, we said the right things, we're going to be okay, but our image still remains a judge who's going to determine, are we in or not? And if it's not a judge, then for many people in our culture, it's kind of a grumpy old dude, right, who needed to eat breakfast but skipped it, and other things are going on. It's just not in a good mood, and they're kind of cower our way into it, not to take away anything from the holiness of God or how expansive and amazing and awesome God is, but how things might be different if when we imagine what might be next after this life, if we put the image of Jesus that we see here. If we see the presence of God working through Jesus in this way, knowing that there's going to be a reconciliation moment, a restoration, how does that change our expectation of what's to come? No longer a distant judge, ready to whack us down, but a guy we love, a guy everybody loves, who welcomes us with breakfast and a campfire and kind words. I think that's a lot more hopeful. And because of who Jesus is, and that seems to be the way he lived his whole life, I think it's a lot more accurate. Something to think about, something to give you a little bit of hope. Well, so Jesus asked Peter 3 times in a row, do you love me? And the reason why it had to be 3 times is because of those 3 denials. And as soon as Peter heard the 3rd time, that's why he sobered up. And he realized, oh, we're talking about that. And for the first time, maybe, in a while, Peter had to really look at himself. And he had to give up the delusion that he was a brand new 2003 Honda Odyssey. And he had to look at himself and say, I guess I'm more like a 16-year-old 2003 Odyssey. And it shows it. We're all kind of on a spectrum, a continuum of not seeing ourselves very clearly. Peter was more on the self-aggrandizement side, wanting to keep his image pristine and perfect and good to ward off anybody who might be challenging him and his personality. Some of us are more on the self-loathing side. We can never think such high thoughts, so we're kind of in this more worm state where, we're not worth anything because of things that have happened to us or things that have been told of us, so we're more on that side. I think we're all more on one side or the other, the self-aggrandizement side, or we're more on the self-loathing side. If you just tighten that down, we're more on one side or the other. If you tighten that even further, what I'm really saying is we're all morons. We're more on one side or the other. But I'm actually quite sincere, because the quicker we can get to a place where we just own it, and we just own the fact that we don't have it together as much as we sometimes would care to have others believe, the lot sooner we will be able to experience a restoration which is going to look a lot like realized resurrection, new life now, when we are honest about ourselves and our junk. We don't like to do this. We all have embarrassing parts of our 2003 Odysseys that we'd rather people not see. But I have a hunch that if we just started the day, not in a self-loathing way, not in a destructive way, but just in a very honest way, just admitting we are human beings and therefore we are susceptible to a great many things. And if we use our collective past as a potential predictor of the future, we might say things like this. Okay, well, given my past, and I may be speaking for me, I may be speaking for you, may be speaking for all of us, I could be really grumpy today. I could just have an edge. I could have a chip on my shoulder. I'm ready to bite somebody's head off. That's possible for me today because that's how I've been in the past sometimes. Or I could lie through my teeth because I don't want that person at work to think poorly of me or my spouse or my kids or my boss or my neighbor. And so I'm going to keep it looking like everything is perfect, even if it isn't. I'm going to walk around talking about equality and how important I think it is for all these things, but inwardly, I really have trouble with certain people groups mostly who aren't just like me. And gender, I'm a guy. I don't know if I can really handle equality with women. Sexual orientation, you name it. I might not say it out loud, but it's there. These kinds of things, when we talk about them, these are come to Jesus types of statements. They're not saying that's who we will be, but it's admitting where we are. It's admitting that we're driving around in a vehicle that shows its wear. And when we're honest about where we are on our life odyssey, aware of the odyssey that we're driving, we have a lot better shot at God actually doing something restorative in us. So one of the truths about resurrection is you can't have resurrection without death. Something has to die in order for that something to live. And one of the things that must die with us are some ideas about ourselves that we know to be false. Because what is calling us forward wants to restore us so fully, so differently, wants to resurrect us, that when we're on the other side of that thing, we would even go so far as to say, we have been born again. But one has to come before the other. An honesty about where we are, an honesty about what we see in ourselves so that we can think about what's next. Now, Peter, he did still have his trouble here and there. He was a human being, and he got himself into some messes now and again. But for the most part, his I love you, Jesus stuff really stuck. In fact, another 3 questions in a row kind of thing showed up in the next season of his life. He's at an unusual place where a good Jewish guy wouldn't be. He's at a tanner's residence, which means there's a lot of dead animals in this place. And if you're a good law-abiding Jew, you don't go to places where there's a lot of dead animals. And yet he's there at this home, and he's having a time of prayer on the rooftop of this place right before lunch. And he's in meditation. He's hungry. And so he gets this custom-made vision from God. Happens 3 times in a row. This big, tablecloth sheet type thing comes out of heaven, and inside this big sheet of stuff are all kinds of foods that Jewish people can't eat. And every time it's lowered, he hears this voice saying, "Take and eat." And every time this happens, Pete says, he puts on the facade and says, "Oh no, I'm a good Jew. I'm not going to screw this one up. I learned long ago what's on the naughty list, and I'm not going to eat any of those things." But every time it still keeps coming. And the 3rd time, the voice finally says, "Don't call unclean what I have said is clean." In other words, this voice is saying, it's okay. I'm telling you it's okay. And this was really a reference, not just about food, although Pete was pretty happy because he heard pork sandwiches were pretty awesome, and they are, and bacon, among other things. But it really had to do with what was going to happen next in this moment. He said yes to this invitation of God, and that totally changed the trajectory of Christian history. Because there was a knock at the door, and the Spirit of God told him to honor what was being asked. That knock led to a journey to a household of a man who worked for the Roman military, pretty high up. That led to Peter talking about Jesus and experience. That led to this whole household saying yes to following this Jesus. That's called the Gentile inclusion. That led to you and I who are here, who do not have Jewish blood running in our veins. It opened the door to everybody. There's no way Peter could have ever imagined such a thing. He was in a new ride. There's no way he could have ever predicted this. And that's kind of my point. Peter's ride, his familiar ride to this point, let's switch the metaphor, was a fishing boat. He never imagined him being a leader on a global scale, which brings us to the next and final slide. So we have the original thing, the thing that maybe we like to think we are. We have the real thing, which is the beat-up version, which also has great memories, by the way. I mean, my family, we created so many good memories in this beat-up ride, but it looks like we created a lot of memories in this thing. So the question is then, what's next? I have 2 friends. It's better than that. I have more than 2 friends, but I have 2 friends. I have 2 friends that bought automobiles that after they bought them, they began to increase in value. That doesn't happen that often. But these 2 guys do. And in one case, it's my neighbor actually across the street. He owns this, I think it's now a 20-year-old Mercedes coupe. And he bought it for a pretty good price. Now it's worth double that because there aren't many of this particular car and then that kind of a condition. I have another friend who bought a car. It's worth now 50% more than he purchased it. And both of these cars are going to continue rising in value. And that brings up a question. So is our hope here today that we will become fancy, shiny, new, renewed 2003 Honda Odysseys? Raise your hand if you're excited about that. Right. Lynn and I were so proud to drive that thing. I think we're the only 2 people in the world proud to drive their minivan for that 2-week period of time, right? Well, maybe for some people. I don't know. Maybe you're a minivan person. But you know, I think it's better than that. I think we limit ourselves in these ways. I think for Peter, he may have said, because I think this is part of his story, he says, you know, I started out as a fishing boat. But then I turned into this huge bus to bring a whole lot more people on a journey to somewhere they could never have imagined. You probably won't be a 2003 Honda Odyssey. You're probably going to be something that you can't recognize, just like the disciples couldn't recognize Jesus. You might become something totally different, and yet you know God is at work in it. You may become a school bus, where you started out as a 2003 Honda Odyssey, but now you're a school bus. You're taking kids where they need to go. You're helping them get educated in different ways. You're taking them on field trips. You're entrusted with them, and you're doing your job. Maybe you're going to be a dump truck, taking care of garbage around the world, and you're taking it where you want to go, and they're fun to drive. Maybe you're a snow plow. You're making roads for people where they can't get to on their own. Maybe you're not even a 4-tire type vehicle. Maybe you're a ship that's converted into a hospital to go into places that don't have the capacity to do surgeries, like after hurricanes in Haiti or other parts of the world, and that's your ride now. Maybe you are a SpaceX rocket that you're going to be used again and again and again to communicate great things to the world. Maybe all of those things are going to be a part of what resurrection means for you here and now. Because resurrection is meant to not just be after the grave, it's meant today. And I would, I guess, it's your call. I think most people fall into this category. You're welcome to enjoy the 16-year-old Odyssey and keep fixing her up and all that, and that's all right. I think what is going to come for you after the grave is still going to come for you, but can you see the vision of what could be? If you laid it down, if you allowed Jesus to do his thing in you, the Spirit of God, to maybe give you a new idea of who you are becoming, a resurrected you now. And let me tell you something. When you start to experience the resurrection now, your hope and confidence about the resurrection to come skyrockets. If it's only this theological head trip about, did I say the right things at the right time? Is that going to get me through the gates? That can give you some level of confidence. But there is no substitute for experience. Because as you walk hand in hand with the Spirit of God, and the Spirit of God leads you to even these delicate conversations of, do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And we are honest with ourselves and with God, and choose to be honest and transparent, and choose to allow God to work with us, in us, transforming us into something new and different, a new creation. When we do that, we have no doubts about what is to come, because we have already seen God at work today. And that's what Easter is about now. Will you celebrate Easter today? What is God calling you into? Let's pray together. God, it is so easy to just be comfortable in our broken down vessels. It's familiar. It's where we have a lot of memories. It's what is known. But you invite us out onto the water. You invite us to be free. Still celebrating what was, but recognizing that's not all that is. Nor will it be all that will be. And so even now, God, I think that your never-ending, reckless love is inviting us to be honest about where we are, where we've been. And I think you're inviting us forward into something new, a resurrected us. And we have no idea. We can't even think about what that could look like because it's just going to be so different. Like a seed planted into the ground becomes a plant we could have never imagined. So you want to do with us. So do it. Help us in our weakness to say yes. Help us to recognize your Spirit's voice. Help us to build on the promise of your presence. And as we approach the grave, and as we look beyond it, we will have growing hope. Thanks be to God. In Jesus' name, amen. So glad you're here today. Start 2 new series. One is a short one starting next week called The Stuff of Life. And we're talking about stuff. How do we as Jesus followers deal with our stuff? And we live in a consumeristic, materialistic world, so we're going to spend a few weeks talking about how to balance that stuff out in healthy ways. And then we're going to get into some very deep weeds, deep theological journey. It's going to take 5 to 6 weeks based on a book that helps us answer the question, why bad things happen, why good things don't happen where we want them to happen, and what does it mean that God is in control? And it's based on a theologian's book called God Can't. Very provocative, very interesting. It should be a lot of fun. So those are the 2 things coming up. Summer, we're going to give you a kind of a fun one, a Bob Goff series that's going to be amazing, and we'll see what happens in the fall. But for now, thanks for being here. Happy Easter. One more time, He is risen. He is risen indeed. Yes, He is. Let's stand together, rise and sing.